Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History of the United States. I'm co-author of Patriot's History of the United States, Larry Swikart, with Michael Allen. And as you can see, I have a new book up on screen. This is it. This is the Patriot's History of Globalism, its rise and decline, coming in February. And boy, are we going to have an offer for you. It's basically going to involve you sign up for Wild World of Politics Insider or Wild World of History VIP, either one will give you an autographed copy of the book. How's that? You won't get any better than that. That'll be up on the website probably in early December. So keep your Christmas shopping ready. We can give this as a gift to anybody who has an email address. Just give us an email address and we can take care of it. All right. We are in still, this has been a really long chapter, right? I think when I filmed this, I filmed it in 3 separate parts. It was so long, this chapter. But we're in chapter 5, which is Small Republic, Big Shoulders. And last time we read President Madison's war message, which was kind of wordy. But hey, I want to read all the documents so you get to see all of the documents, right? So we are now, and this is again the 15th anniversary edition. So if you have an earlier edition, it might not line up page-wise, but I'm on page 184. Now, if you're really earlier, as I always say, if you have before 10th edition, even the header might not line up. Usually they're the same, but we did change a few of them. So we're on page 184, Old Hickory and the War of 1812. Americans' recollections of the War of 1812 provide an excellent example of selective memory. Today, those Americans who know anything at all about the war remember the War of 1812 for Andrew Jackson's famed Battle of New Orleans, 1815. One of the most spectacular victories in the history of the American military, and more generally that we won. What most Americans do not know or tend to forget is that the Battle of New Orleans was fought 2 weeks after the war technically ended. Slow communications delayed news of the peace treaty, and neither the British nor the American troops in Louisiana learned of the war's end until after the famed battle. The United States squared off against a nation that possessed the greatest navy on earth and would soon achieve land superiority as well. The British could count on 8,000 Anglo-Canadian and Indian allies to bolster their strength. Americans enjoyed, excuse me 1 second, I suddenly have a runny nose. Okay, we're back. Sorry, my nose just decided to start running here. You know, it's always something. I mean, I remember the night in my Wild Wednesday webcasts when I had many, many weeks of buildup, and I was going to do a Wild Wednesday webcast on critical race theory and the 1619 Project. And normally I would have between 15 and 35 people on my Wild Wednesday webcast. Well, that night I had almost 100. And of course, that day I got COVID. I got the China virus. So I was hacking, and I know I clear my throat a lot too much, but I was much worse then than I am now. So today it's the runny nose demon. So obviously I'm doing something important here that the devil doesn't want to have done. All right. We are back to paragraph 2. The British could count on 8,000 Anglo-Canadian and Indian allies to bolster their strength. Americans enjoyed many of the same military advantages held during the Revolution, a defensive stance, and Britain's embroilment in global warfare with France. As in the Revolution, however, the Yankees had few regular troops and sailors to press those advantages. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy possessed a competent officer corps, but few ships and gunboats for them to command. Or, to use the British assessment of American naval capabilities, quote, a few fur-built frigates manned by a handful of bastards and outlaws, unquote. Events seemed ominous, and indeed General William Hull marched his 1,600 regular U.S. Army troops and militia supplement into Canada via Detroit in July of 1812, only to surrender to Anglo-Canadian troops without firing a shot. Hull became a scapegoat and was court-martialed for cowardice, but pardoned by President Madison. A second Canadian land invasion, December 1813, fared only a little better, resulting in a stalemate, followed by General Jacob Brown's July 1814 campaign on the Niagara Peninsula, again ending in a stalemate. 3 Canadian campaigns, 3 embarrassments. The long-held American dream of adding Canada to the United States by military conquest had ended once and for all during the War of 1812. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about these Canadian campaigns and why they didn't work. First and foremost, Canada was still overwhelmingly Catholic at that time. The British had taken it over from the French, and the French Catholics had settled most of Canada. Second, ever since the time of the Revolution, the British had treated Canada as a more or less favored Dominion state. So remember back right before the Revolution in the Intolerable Acts, the American colonies were to be put under the administration of Canada. And that was a major problem because Americans saw Canada as essentially a papist nation. And so even after Anglicans settled in Canada, it was still not viewed favorably by the Northeast, the Puritans. Second, the Canadians had developed a much different culture. Whereas Americans were kind of land-oriented, moving into the interior, creating farms and so on, the Canadians were still trade-oriented via furs regarding their major cities such as Ontario, Montreal, Quebec. So they didn't really share that with us. Third, the British had done nothing to antagonize the Canadians between 1770 and 1812. They'd done a lot to antagonize the Americans, but nothing to antagonize the Canadians. And so it was an absolute failure to understand who the Canadians were and what their motivations were when we tried to invade. We just thought, oh, they'll want to throw off the British yoke too. Well, to them, the British yoke wasn't a yoke at all. It's kind of what Jesus said, take my yoke upon you and it'll be easy and my burden is light. That's the way they looked at it. So this was a bad misjudgment about who Canada was and what they wanted. The lawyer Robert Barnes is always big on saying that he very much tries to get inside the head of his opposing lawyers, prosecutors, or jurors, so that he knows what buttons to push, what will motivate them, what will cause a prosecutor to make a mistake, or what will cause a juror to vote in favor of his case. And we just did not take the time to do that, and we paid very seriously for it. If you want a good book on this, and it's hugely long, I got to tell you, it's even longer than ours. It's called The Birth of the Modern by Paul Johnson. And his chapter on the War of 1812 is exceptional. And I urge, if you want more information, yeah, there's some great books. Coles has a great book, The War of 1812. But Johnson, being a Brit, has a Brit who loves America, but still a Brit, he has a particularly good take on this. All right, let's keep going. I am now on page 185. On the high seas, the United States fared somewhat better. American privateers carried on the revolutionary strategy of looting British shipping, but with little tactical impact. The U.S. Navy, with its minimal forces, somehow won 80% of the initial sea battles. By the way, this shocked the British. Although this strategic impact was insignificant, these actions yielded the most famous lines in American seafaring. Captain James Lawrence in 1807, for example, his ship, the Chesapeake, defeated by the Leopard and her veteran crew, lying mortally wounded, had shouted, "Don't give up the ship, fight her till she sinks." The War of 1812 then produced the most notable one-on-one naval confrontation in the arrivals of the U.S. Navy when the Constitution engaged the British Guerriere. Marines boarded the British ship and, after blasting away her rigging, forced her to surrender. This was just an absolute shock. I mean, this is one of the most shocking defeats at sea you could have, even compared to something like Trafalgar, where the whole French Navy was basically wiped out or put out of action for the rest of the war. After the battle, the resiliency of the Constitution's hull left her with the nickname Old Ironsides. It was a single engagement, but the London Times noted its galling significance, quote, "Never before in the history of the world did an English frigate strike to an American." They should have probably wanted to add lousy American. Much of the war at sea did not go as well. Jefferson's gunboats, thoroughly outclassed by British frigates, retreated to guard duty of ports. This constituted a demoralizing admission that Jefferson's policies had failed and was confirmed by a congressional vote in 1813 to fund 6 new frigates, essentially doubling the U.S. fleet in a single stroke. There were also famous naval battles on inland waters on Lake Erie in 1813. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry built a fleet from scratch, deployed it on the lake, and defeated the British in an impressive victory at Put-in Bay. This was significant because the Americans developed a tactic the British had not seen. They would take a ship on the Great Lakes, and they had anchors at each end. And when they came within firing range, they dropped those anchors. So here's the British ship, here's the British ship, here's the American ship. American ship would fire, and as the British were firing, it would turn, first of all, making its target lower. The crew would use ropes attached to the anchors to literally pull the ship around 180 degrees and fire the next round, while the British were busy trying to reload and then pull the ship all the way back around again. So essentially, we could fire 2 volleys for every 1 British volley because of this technique. It was quite brilliant. Not to be outclassed by Edward Lawrence, Perry declared afterward, quote, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Those few victories gave Americans hope that after the second full year of war, the tide was turning. After the British defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, they turned their attention to the North American War. Fortified by battle-hardened veterans from the European theater, England launched an ambitious 3-pronged offensive in 1814 aimed at Chesapeake Bay and Washington, D.C. Lake Champlain and New Orleans, aimed at Chesapeake Bay and Washington, D.C., Lake Champlain, and New Orleans. So those are the 3 prongs. They planned to split America into thirds, crippling resistance once and for all. Initially, their plan worked well. On August 24th, 1814, 7,000 American militiamen turned tail, allowing the British Army to raid Washington, D.C., and burn government buildings. This is when the militia went out to try to fight the British in open field, and the British easily defeated the militia. British were outnumbered. The militia turned tail and ran, and it was called the Bladensburg Races for where it took place, Bladensburg, Maryland. So the British immediately followed up. They raided Washington, D.C. and burned government buildings, sending President Madison and his wife running to the countryside, literally yanking valuables off the White House walls as they ran to save them from the invaders. This is an amazing scene. The Secretary of War was technically in charge of all American land forces, but he couldn't be found anywhere. I think his name was Eaton. Couldn't be found anywhere. And so Madison had gone out, literally as commander-in-chief, on his horse to Bladensburg to oversee the defenses. But the men collapsed and ran so fast, Madison was ahead of them, trying to stay out of the grip of the British. When he got back to the White House, he found the table had been set with dinner and the wine glasses were full, but Dolly wasn't there. Dolly ran out when she heard the news and took a few White House valuables and took the Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington off the wall and took it with her and headed for the ferry to get across the river. Madison was about half an hour behind her. So he comes in, sees all this, heads for the ferry to catch up with Dolly. The British enter Washington, D.C. They set fire to Congress. They set fire to some other arsenals. They did not deliberately set fire to the White House, but it caught fire anyway. And it didn't burn down, but it did get blackened. And so that's when they repainted it white, and it then became known as the White House after they repainted it. Meanwhile, the British general Cockburn said he was going to bring Madison back in a cage to be shown there in England as an oddity, right? Of course, he didn't do that. Madison gets to the crossing, the ferry. Dolly's nowhere to be found. So he crosses, then he goes back up into Maryland to try to locate the army or Eaton. He rides for almost 24 hours straight and can't find either Dolly or the army. Dolly, meanwhile, had gotten to an inn, and when she arrived, she was refused service because her husband started this war, and it was highly unpopular there. Finally, she got to a farmhouse where the farmer gave her protection and let her sleep there, gave her dinner, but one of the cooks wouldn't serve her coffee because she said, I done hear Mr. Madison surrendered the army to the British. So Madison is trying to catch up with her. He finally, after 30 hours in the saddle, doesn't catch up to her, but catches up to Eaton, fires him on the spot, takes over command of the army, and then puts Monroe in command of the army. It's odd that for a few minutes, James Monroe, the Secretary of State, was holding 3 jobs. He was Secretary of State. When Madison was out of the White House, he was president, acting president. And when Eaton was fired, he was technically acting Secretary of Defense. So that's what was happening for James Madison. All right. This infamous loss of the nation's capital, albeit temporarily, ranks alongside Pearl Harbor and the surrender of Corregidor as low points in the Americans' military history, and the destruction of the White House marked the most traumatic foreign assault on the mainland, American soil, ever until the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. After burning Washington, the British moved up the Chesapeake Bay to assault Baltimore. They unsuccessfully bombarded Fort McHenry for 25 hours, inspiring Patriot Francis Scott Key to compose the Star-Spangled Banner, and lost 350 men in a land assault. Now, this is an amazing story in itself as well. They had taken down the large American flag, which you do when you're being shelled, and they put up a smaller flag known as a storm flag. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer. He had come to negotiate a prisoner exchange, but he was put off on another non-combatant ship while the British frigates engaged in combat, because the British commander didn't want this man traveling under a white flag to get killed. So Francis Scott Key was observing all this, and there's some bad videos going around about this. I mean, they're heart-rending, they're tugging, but it didn't happen. One of the videos conflates the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Let's get this straight. First of all, there was never, ever, ever a question that if we lost this war, the British would own America again. Was it going to happen? That's what neither side was fighting for. British hadn't even remotely considered it. They would never engage in another guerrilla war on American soil. They knew better than that. Second, part of this story, again, it sounds good, it's very heart-rending, but it didn't happen. Part of this story is that American soldiers within Fort McHenry were running out and holding up the flag and were dying, and that literally that flag was held up by a mound of Patriot bodies. Didn't happen. The fact is the British did target the flagpole, but it was a storm flag and they couldn't really do much damage to it. It was too small, and they weren't having any success at all at hammering McHenry's walls. And the next day, without taking McHenry, as I said, they tried a short assault, and those were pushed back easily by American regular troops, not militia. So when the firing on McHenry was over and the British essentially gave up, the commandant there ordered the storm flag taken down and the real big American flag raised again. And that's what Francis Scott Key saw when he said, by the dawn's early light, and the flag was still there. Actually, it was a different flag, but it was still there. So, I mean, listen to these if you want, but please understand that real history is dramatic enough. We don't need fictional history to tell us how great some of these events were. So please don't get caught up in that stuff. I've heard it now a couple of times from different people, and it's just sad that people buy into this without even reading a darn book. Okay. Oh, by the way, the words were written by Francis Scott Key, but a melody wasn't added till much later on. And it didn't become the national anthem until the late 1800s at some point. Up till that time, I think we used a version of God Save the Queen, My Country 'Tis of Thee, or other American patriotic songs. But Star Spangled Banner did not become the official anthem until much later. It was widely circulated. It was printed and distributed everywhere, so people knew the lyrics. And I know today that the lyrics the melody is really hard to sing. It's considered to be one of the hardest national anthems out there, but the lyrics are great. Okay. Page 186. Further north on the Niagara frontier, Sir George Prebost's 10,000-man army met defeat at the hands of an American force 1/10 its size at the Battle of Chippewa. There, American regulars relieved the militia with stunning results. At a distance of 70 yards, the British and American infantry blasted at each other until the British broke and the Americans, clad in the gray cadet uniforms of the United States Military Academy, i.e. West Point, chased them off the field. The British commander, shocked that he had not come up against militia, blurted, "Those are regulars, by God." It marked an admission by the British that while militia could be erratic, the American regular soldier was as good as any in the world. At the northeastern end of the New York State on Lake Champlain, a concurrent naval battle brought a spectacular American victory. Captain Thomas McDonough, the 30-year-old American commander, rallied his sailors, reminding them, quote, "Impressed seamen call on every man to do his duty." Although knocked unconscious by a soaring, decapitated sailor's head, McDonough delivered so much firepower that he sent Prevost and the British running. Despite these morale builders, there was more potential trouble in store. By the late fall of 1814, a 3,000-man British army under General Edward Pakenham was en route via ocean vessel to attack New Orleans. More than 2 years of warfare on land and sea had produced no clear victor on either side. Combat and stalemate had, however, inspired new opposition from New England's Federalists. When war commenced, Federalists thwarted it in many ways, some bordering on treason. A planned invasion of Canada through Lower Maine proved impossible because the Massachusetts and Connecticut militia refused to assist. Wouldn't help. Meanwhile, New Englanders maintained personal lines of communication with Britons, providing aid and comfort, and thereby reducing the bargaining powers of American negotiators at Ghent, Belgium. Particularly in New York and Vermont, Americans struggled and sold supplies to Canadians and the British to get to the great consternation of American commanders in the area. And the New Englanders appeared to be rewarded at the polls with solid 1812 electoral gains in the presidential campaign and large 1814 victories for Federalists in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Delaware, and Maryland. This book is very interesting. I recommend this. It's called The History of the Democratic Party, Democracy Betrayed by Nelson Dawson. And he makes a very good point that part of this, especially in the South, was a concern that by opening New Orleans and Florida, taking the land from Indians, that slavery would be allowed to expand. And that is one of the reasons, not the most important, but it was one of the reasons the Federalists so opposed this war that they saw as a Jeffersonian war. Federalists, their descent came to a head with the Hartford Convention in December 1814, which marked the height of Federalist intransigence and the last installment in their dark descent. Federalist delegates from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, and Rhode Island gathered in Hartford, Connecticut. This is in the middle of a war. Discussed and debated administration, foreign policy, and other issues, and concluded by calling for a separate peace between New England and the British and a constitutional amendment limiting the power of southern and western states. This was the second time New Englanders had danced around the issue of secession, having hatched a plot in 1804 to leave the Union if Jefferson was reelected. Across the ocean at Ghent, Belgium, British and American negotiators, including Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Albert Gallatin, parlayed well into the Christmas season. The days wore on, and Adams complained to his diary that the gregarious Clay kept him up all night drinking and gambling with the British colleagues. At last, both sets of negotiators concluded they possessed no military advantage. Britain's European victory over Napoleon, meanwhile, opened up a series of prospects and obligations they needed to immediately pursue. At long last, both nations agreed it was time to compromise and end the War of 1812. On Christmas Eve, the deal was struck. Americans withdrew their two major demands that Britain stop impressing American seamen and officially acknowledge neutrals' rights of trades and freedom of the seas. Both sides knew that Britain's European victory meant England would now honor the neutral rights de facto, if not de jure. That is, they had no reason to keep doing it. Other territorial disputes over fishing waters and the American-Canadian boundary near Maine were referred to commissioners, where they languished for decades. The Treaty of Ghent thus signified that, officially at least, the war had changed nothing, and the terms of peace were such that conditions were now the same as they had been prior to the war. This is a term called status quo ante bellum. Madison must have been apprehensive about presenting such a peace without victory for the approval of the U.S. Senate. Fortunately for Madison's party, news of the Ghent Treaty arrived in Washington, D.C. at exactly the same time as news of an ultimately yet nevertheless glorious American military victory. On January 8, 1815, Andrew Jackson's odd coalition of American troops had pounded General Pakenham's British regulars and won the famed Battle of New Orleans. Jackson's victory was mythologized once again with a David and Goliath twist, in which the outnumbered American sharpshooters defeated the disciplined redcoats. fact was that Jackson's men were seasoned combat veterans of the Creek Indian Theater of the War of 1812 and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, 1814. Now at New Orleans, they were joined by a polyglot collection of local French, Creole, and Cajun, Spanish, free black troops, and a few Caribbean pirates under Jean Lafitte thrown in for good measure. The nub of the army remained hardcore Jackson veterans, except for key Creole militia artillery units. Together, they manned the breastworks of the Chalmette near New Orleans and awaited Pakenham's force of 8,000. I've been there. Fairly narrow battlefield. Jackson and his men, okay, so stretching down this way in kind of a V was the Chalmette battlefield. Right across the Cortez Canal, a long riverway, was a second battlefield with more American militia troops and a few regulars. The British plan was to attack both simultaneously. Oddly, and it shouldn't have happened this way, the British on the far side actually were able to defeat the Americans and send them running way before the battle on Jackson's side started. This should have been very bad news for Jackson. He should have suffered from enfilade fire, that is, fire coming from his side, but he wasn't. So we kind of lucked out there. Instead, in this kind of narrow battlefield, the British had drawn up in these big ranks with their redcoats in a fog. And the fog lifted at just the right time. Jackson, earning the name Old Hickory after his exploits in the war, had all the advantages. His men were dug in on both sides of the Mississippi, protected by a thick breastwork, and the British had to either endure murderous enfilade fire or simultaneously attack both positions. Always a tricky proposition. Most important, Jackson had plenty of artillery and had chosen the perfect ground. A dense swamp on the British right, or his left, and a canal on his right or their left, and a large expanse of open field over which the redcoats would have to cross. It's sort of like the Battle of Bunker Hill all over again, but the British couldn't outflank them. Merely getting to the battlefield proved a disaster for the British because their troops had to row through the lakes and marshes, with each British guardsman carrying an 8-pound cannonball in his knapsack. When several of these boats tipped over, hundreds of soldiers sank like the lead they carried. Under the cover of a dawn fog, the British drew up for a bold frontal assault on the American position. Then suddenly that same fog that had concealed their formation in the field lifted, revealing them to Jackson's guns. Sharpshooting militiamen using Kentucky long rifles, accurate at hundreds of yards, took their toll, but the British ranks were broken by the Louisiana artillerymen. Pakenham himself was shot several times and died on the field alongside more than 2,000 British casualties, dramatically contrasting with the 21 Americans killed. Adding insult to injury, or death in this case, the deceased Pakenham suffered the indignity of having his body stuffed into a cask of rum for preservation en route back to England. Jackson emerged a hero, and soon Americans were dancing to a popular song about his army that bragged, quote, "Every man was half a horse and half an alligator." Madison pardoned pirate Jean Lafitte thanks to his contribution, and Federalists looked like fools for their untimely opposition. It was a bloody affair, but not, as many historians suggest, a useless one. Quote, "A needless encounter and a needless war," the refrain goes. One conclusion was inescapable after the war: the Americans were rapidly becoming the equals of any power in Europe. So let's just wrap this chapter up. A nation whose spirit was everywhere. Notwithstanding 1,000 blunders, John Adams wrote candidly and jubilantly to Jefferson in 1814, President James Madison had, quote, "acquired more glory and established more union than all three of his predecessors, Washington's, Adams, Jefferson put together." It had to be hard for Adams to write. Perhaps Adams meant to rub salt in Jefferson's wounds, but by any measure, the changes for America over a period of just a few months were indeed stunning. America's execution of the war had exacted a begrudging respect from the British. In the future, Britain and all Europe would resort to negotiation, not war, in disputing America. They had learned to fear and respect this new member in the family of nations. America's subsequent reference to the War of 1812 as the Second War for Independence was well-founded. On the home front, war produced important military and political changes, especially in the Ohio Valley, where the hostile Indian tribes were utterly defeated. But so too were the Creek of Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. The War of 1812 set the stage for the First Seminole War of 1818, Black Hawk's War of 1832, and the federal Indian removal that would, in a mere 25 years, exile most remaining Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Chickasaw Indians to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. A shameful thing. In a sense, the War of 1812 was not so much a victory over England as over the Indians, smashing the power forever of all the tribes east of the Mississippi. And I think this is where I strongly disagree with the book I talked about 2 sessions ago, Indigenous Continent, where he kind of sees the Indians still as in control. I don't think so. After the War of 1812, they were pretty much beaten, except for a few tribal tribes on the plains. Politically, the Federalist Party died its last stalwart slinking into the Republican opposition and forming a viable new National Republican caucus. They learned to practice the democratic politics of Jeffersonians had perfected, mingle with the crowds, and by rounds of liquor, host campaign barbecues and fish fries, shake hands, and perhaps even kiss a few babies. In this way, these nationalists were able to continue to expound Hamilton's program of tariffs, banks, and subsidized industrialism, but do so in a new democratic rhetoric that appealed to the common man, soon seen in the programs championed by Henry Clay. Within the Republican Party, National Republicans continued to battle old Republicans over the legacy of the American Revolution. Within a generation, these National Republicans would form the Whig Party. Jefferson's ideologically pure old Democratic Republicans died, yielding to a newer, more aggressive political machine under the Jacksonians. Tragically, the increasingly Southern bent of the old Republicans meant that the radical individualism, decentralism, and states' rights tenets of Jeffersonianism would, under the Southern Democrats, be perverted. And again, take a look at this book, Democracy Betrayed. He makes that case really well, that the states' rights concepts that Southerners like to brag about so much were really perverted, and they were used only for one issue, to protect slavery. Jefferson's libertarian ideals, the ideals of the American Revolution, would incongruously be used to defend the enslavement of 3 million human beings. Now, that wraps up chapter 5. Just one postscript here. Again, Paul Johnson's Birth of the Modern, great book, and he makes an excellent point. Remember, he's a Brit writing about America. And he said the fact that nobody really won the War of 1812 was crucially important, because it led the Americans to be more diplomatic in their moves with the British, and it led the British to be more respectful of the Americans. For the first time after the War of 1812, they received actual American ambassadors, and they started referring really to America as a nation. Up till that time, they kind of avoided that language. So it also taught the Americans the value of a powerful Navy. And although this would dwindle some between 1814 and 1860, obviously, with the Civil War, the Navy would be built to the gills. I mean, we would really start building a lot of warships. And by the end of the Civil War, we would have the 3rd most powerful Navy in the world, maybe the 2nd. So very important changes. Johnson argues strongly that it was good for both nations that nobody won the War of 1812. I find it hard to disagree with that assessment. All right, next time we will finally get to chapter 6. I will see you back here then.